Now that we have a nice stove and heat sorted for the cottage cabin business here, next up, and I do apologize if there's a little bit of an echoiness in here, it's kind of empty, so there's a lot of bouncing going on. It's very lovely to have this nice seat here and do just a little bit of light reading as the will takes me, but wouldn't it be just so much nicer if I could recline real good for my reading? And you know what? I think this book actually has just the thing for us. Now, while these late 16th century Italian examples are absolutely gorgeous and intricate with all of these lovely post details and things, I think we're gonna go just a little bit more simple. And maybe we'll go for some nice late medieval where there's not as many extant beds to get information from, but there are tons, dozens upon dozens of manuscript images showing approximately what beds would have looked like. Some nice square posts at the end, maybe topped with a round or acorn-shaped finial. Now, starting from the ground up, the first thing that we're going to need to work on is the bed frame or bedstead, which it seems to have been called according to the wills and inventories that I've been able to find. And that is going to be a nice wooden frame made courtesy of the fallen ash tree from our neighbor's yard that they gave us and Mr. Morgandonner's wood shop.
The process started with me using my Alaskan mill to cut up all of the lumber into boards, and then we stickered and dried it out in our basement using some dehumidifiers to bring it down to 10% moisture content. It's been a while since last project, and most of my saws, chisels, and planes needed some sharpening up before I could get started. So there was a little bit of rust removal that I'm ashamed of, but that's that. We've already cut the lumber to size, so the next step is laying out and forming all of the joints. I started with the footboard by cutting in the channels that the raised panel would sit into and forming the tenons on it. That gives me a sense of how far apart the mortises need to be on each of the posts. Once I have that, I'm going to mark, chisel, and then drill out most of the meat of those mortises, allowing me to clean them up with a chisel afterwards.
And then here is, I believe, the end board. So this is the width across, and you saw the holes that he was just making. These are gonna go in there.
Here I used a technique more common to kitchen and dining room tables called a castle joint, but it allowed me to have the sideboards and the footboard join the post at roughly the same height.
Ooh, you can kind of see right there how it's going through. Neat. And then so the peg is just going to be kind of like a dowel, like a big dowel that goes down through and sort of locks everything together.
Yeah, I'm just going to use a 1/4 incher.
And so that's what you were saying about the tape protecting the surface. Nice, nice, nice. So these are the sides.
What I saw in the extant example was there was one that had sort of a shelf, and then the holes were above the shelf. And all I can think is that they had started with slats and then decided to go rope.
Yeah, but that's kind of nice. That means that you can choose to either put slats for the siding if you want, or do rope with the holes. Like, it's kind of a either or, whichever you want.
Next up is the headboard. It's important to make sure that the headboard sits into the post, making it strong enough that when we lean against it while we're reading in bed, it's not gonna just snap and fall back or bow and fall out of the joints. So I made some channels into the post, which I could do with a router, but honestly, it's easy enough if you have a mortising chisel.
I see the tabs are going to go into the post there, and then the headboard bit is going to go into that slot kind of to the end, I think.
I got lazy, so I didn't want to have to mortise for the center panel, and that's the one place where I deviated and I used poplar instead of ash. But so I added a center panel so we'd have more to lean against for the headboard. And then I did mortise for the actual headboard where I think most of the weight will go. Hey, finally it's time for the test fit. So this part, it really helps to have a second set of hands or paws. Now, when you're going about this part, it's common to find out that you're gonna need to shave down your tenons a little bit to fit into the mortises better, and it's always easier to clean up a tenon than it is a mortise. While he continues working on the frame, I'm gonna start working on the next level up, which is the mat. So the frame itself is held together with ropes, right? But that's kind of a rather uneven surface as well as a little bit
holy. So by putting a mat over top, we help smooth out the ropes as well as provide a nice even surface for the mattress so that none of it can fall through. So from what I can tell, mats were made from rushes, which is a type of really long grass that was braided and woven together. Now, unfortunately, we are in the very middle of winter with a nice thick blanket of snow outside, so my ability to go out and collect some nice long grass to play with is a little bit limited. However, I do have a lovely basket here of old scraps to play with instead. So I have got a bunch of things like this velvet curtain that became a couple different items, and I have pieces that I didn't use because it's got weird curtain stuff on it. I also have some old clothes in here, like this dress, which I think is super pretty, but unfortunately it is very, very worn. It is not fit to be clothing anymore, but it's still strong in the other direction, this way, so I can tear it into a bunch of strips and use those strips to make a sort of fabric simulation of what a rush mat might be. That's kind of nice because it'll give me a chance to practice the technique even though I don't have the materials yet. And because it's not going to be seen, it's going to go over the ropes and under the mattresses. So this seems like a really excellent way to use the practice piece without letting it go to waste. Like, I'm excited to get started. Now, before we just start tearing up our strips willy-nilly, we do need to have some sort of methodology here, because while these two look very similar, unfortunately, when you actually come to like their total mass, maybe is the word I'm looking for, you know, this is much, much thicker, this velvet, versus this very, very thin cotton. So I feel like I can't just cut everything the same width and have that work out nicely. I think instead what I'm gonna do is take a piece and tightly coil it and measure it. This one's 1/2 inch and I feel like is a pretty good heft. So I think if I aim for all of my pieces to win condensed like this to be about 1/2 inch, I should get a fairly overall even result. Now that I have many different colorful strips of fabric all prepared, to connect them together, I'm going to first roll up the top so that there's not any seam allowance poking out, and then just stitch it to its neighbors until I have a full 7 pieces of fabric in a row. In order to hang it up somewhere to help make it a little bit easier to braid, I'm going to toss in a little thread just to this top area here, and then from there I can hang it up somewhere high. You can use one of those over door style hangers, or if you're sitting down, you might just use a door knob. Anywhere to help kind of secure your braid so that it's not free floating like in your lap. It's easier if there's kind of an anchor point to start from. So I'm going to be doing a 7-strand braid for my project. I'm hoping that'll make it nice and wide, and I can then stitch them together, which we'll cover later. For any kind of braid, for the most part, it's a lot of over, under, over, under. I'm gonna go ahead and do a few inches because I think it'll be easier to see once I have a bit of a base started. The basics behind doing a 7-strand braid is you're going to have 3 in one hand, 4 in the other. It doesn't really matter which one is which because it's gonna switch back and forth which one has 4 and which one has 3. Right now though, this side has 4. You're gonna take the side that has more, which is this one, pick the outside one, and you're gonna go over this strand, under the next one, over the next one, and now this strand has joined this side. So this has 4 and this has 3. And we're just going to do the same thing. Over, and under, and then over the red, and now this has joined this side. And repeat for about 1,000,000 years until you've run out of string, or really in my case, need to add more string, which I will show you once we get to that point. Now, as each piece ends and I need to then attach a new one to keep braiding, I had 2 main methods that I ended up using to attach pieces. First off was just whip stitching them together like so, especially if I had selvage ends like this, or just really strong fabric that I felt like I could butt them together and have them work really nicely for that. So that is one way. The other method that I use, especially for more irregularly shaped ends like this, I would just tuck it up inside the previous piece, kind of wrap it up in there, especially with more grippy fabrics like this red wool. It's got a little bit more texture to it, so it doesn't as easily slip out. If you have slippery fabric, you probably want to stick with the first method, but if you've got enough grip to your fabric, then you can just kind of hold on to that piece and continue your braiding. Once that new piece has had several inches of going back and forth and it's kind of well locked in, I'm sure if I really yanked, I could pull that out, but for the sake of being able to just continue braiding comfortably without worrying about it, this works pretty well. Now, obviously, the big downside is you get these little bits. I decided not to stress out about any of that because this is all going under a mattress, but if you wanted to make sure that these ends don't come out and aren't visible, you can try to do a little bit more kind of careful tucking as you're braiding and make sure that these pieces end up sort of under whatever is going to be your top layer. That means that it's still visible on the underside, but if you know which side's going to be your top, you can, if you like, just really carefully focus on making that top side extra neat and tucked in and pretty. I really did not worry about that for this project though. Now that the frame is all done and we got the ropes put in place, they were still a little bit loosey-goosey, not really ready to support anything yet without sagging a bunch. So next up we made a rope tightening tool, or a rope wrench. Shape-wise, it's pretty simple. It's basically a T with a slot cut into one end so that you can then tuck that into the rope ends and twist it and then secure it in place either with a helper, a second pair of hands, or by kind of tossing a wedge in to hold the rope in place while you go about tightening the next set of rows, and repeat that forever until you have a very tight bed. Now that our bedstead is fully assembled, which is the wooden frame and the rope supports, and they're all nice and tight and good, I think we are ready for the next layer, the mat on top, which I have, for the last couple weeks, been slowly braiding away all of my scrap materials, and I now have this giant behemoth of a braid that we are going to stitch together to make our mat. Starting off with our original starting end with the string for holding. We'll cut that off in a second, but we have this nice bound end, which we're going to start all the way in the upper corner here and just kind of lay it nice and close to the edge of the bed until we get to the end, at which point we're just going to kind of mark off where we think is a good end point for this, and then we are going to do a couple rows of stitches to really secure these pieces together, both where my hand is and a little bit further up, and then we're going to cut in between. To start off with, we're going to use a very comically large needle here, and I am going to thread with some twine. It doesn't have to be green, but this is already very colorful, so why not use my colorful twine? And let's see what we can do here. Now, to be fair, this is my first time doing this, so I'm very much kind of learning along with you guys, and maybe once we get to the end of this project, I will have settled on what is actually the best technique, but let's see how this goes. I'm gonna try securing in the end of the braid using just a couple really quick running stitches back and forth, and then do the same thing to what is gonna be the start of the next row going up. Now you might be wondering why I don't just take my braid and sort of loop it around on itself to create the next row. The downside with that is that it's very, very bulky, which maybe not the end of the world for this particular use case, but I think that I've seen in a lot of the extant ones that the rows go up and down and up and down, and they seem to be kind of capped off at the edge. So I have a feeling that they are actually cut at the edge rather than just turned on themselves. Let's see if it works. So now that I've stitched each of the ends and then cut them apart, we have ends that aren't exactly beautiful, but this is absolutely secure enough for now, especially since later on this is going to get bound on the edges with another layer of fabric, so this is good for now. This mat has been a lot of work, but a lot of fun so far. There are all sorts of versions of grass, rugs, and mats used for flooring for bedding all over the world, so it's really cool to get even a tiny taste of what that might be like. I have finally stitched on the very last row of my braid and have a solid bed mat, which also works quite well, I'd say, as a floor mat, a little kind of area rug. It's not quite an inch thick, but it's really close. If you want some floor insulation, This'll do a decent job. You could also make much thinner pieces. Remember how I made mine to be a 1/2 inch diameter around when compressed? So if you made yours, you know, much smaller than that, you're gonna get a much finer, thinner rug. And your braids themselves are also going to be proportionately smaller to match as well. So something to consider if you're wanting to do something similar, but you feel that my result is a bit too bulky. You can make it less bulky. So now all I have left is finishing off these cut edges on both the foot and the head end of our little mat. It's really cool seeing how on the whole thing, it's like a nifty gradient from one color to another as I was braiding them in. So my game plan for getting this end covered is I have another scrap that was kind of a nice size and shape that what I think I can do here is fold up my edges on either side. I'm going to whip stitch this down on both edges, and I think that should be just about the right size to nicely cover this. All right, we are done with the mat. The ends are all nicely tucked away and won't be fraying anytime soon. So now we're going to work on the next layers up. After the mat is the mattress or mattresses. From what I can tell in a lot of the wills and inventories, it's not uncommon for there to be not just one mattress, but multiple mattresses per bedstead. It's not universal. There's definitely plenty of examples where they just list one mattress, but there's a lot where there's multiple. The Great Bed of Wear, which is a comically large bed, like absurdly large for the sake of being an oddity. I think that the V&A Museum has it, and they did a kind of reconstruction with all the bells and whistles, and they went ahead and did 3 mattresses on theirs. Very fancy. So generally, your mattress is going to be stuffed with something light and fluffy that gives some good squish and loft. Well, hold on. While, you know, wood shavings and stuff would probably work, and it isn't outside of the realm of possibility, from what I can tell, the kind of base layer is usually going to be plant material, but it seems like it's usually things like straw, hay, not hay, because that has seeds. Anyways, waste material, chaff from other parts of planting and food industry, the parts that you don't eat. Sometimes those get stuffed into beds. So if plant-based stuff is usually kind of our lowest tier of mattress, the least nice to use. Next up seems to be flocking or wool. Then after that have feathers. And then after that, down, which I think is just really fluffy feathers. As I was looking through the various wills and inventories, it seems like feather beds are the most common example, with the woolen and flock being pretty common and down being not so common, and very few did I see of the dust and straw beds and things. So at least in the wills. I think it would be super fun to make a late medieval style mattress, but unfortunately I do lack the sheep slash fowl slash honestly even the greenery to stuff a mattress with, given that it's the middle of winter. But I do happen to have a very old, horrifically stained what do you call those soft beds that can sit up? Anyways, whatever the case, it's horrifically stained. So we are not going to be showing that on camera today. I hope you understand. Next up after our mattress or mattresses would be the sheets, a pair of sheets, always 2 in the wills. And I assume that this is for the same reason that we modernly tend to use a pair of sheets. I think that they're the easiest thing to wash as compared to the mattress or the blankets and things that go above. It's also probably the nicest thing to have your skin against. After that, curiously enough, a pair of blankets, which also not as commonly as the sheets, the linen sheets, but pretty commonly it seems like there would be a pair of blankets. After the wool blankets is going to come the coverlet and or rug. So from what I can tell, those are just kind of like the fancy topping blankets. If you are someone who wants to have a fancy topping blanket, you know, they can be made of various materials. The blanket's always wool, but the coverlets and the rugs seems like they have a couple different options. Although I did see something that made me think that rugs are usually very, very fuzzy. What was it? I saw an example of one that said it was a thrummed rug, which if it's like a thrummed cap or thrummed gloves, then that means that it has lots of like fluffy tufts of wool coming through to make it very like shaggy looking. And maybe that's just that one rug, maybe it's more, but I didn't get the impression that they are necessarily meant to be floor rugs the way that we would say it today, from what I can tell. One last note about blankets is specifically quilted blankets. It seems like while they did have quilts, and there's even a really cool example called the Tristan quilt from the early 1400s, the patchwork style that we tend to think of, where it's lots of cut up, colorful pieces that have been stitched together into a nice pattern, doesn't seem like that's a thing. It's more like one color with stitching to help hold the pieces of fabric together, but that's it. There is actually, though, a really cool late 1400s pillowcase or pillow that is patchwork called the Impruneta cushion, and it's really neat. But speaking of pillows, though, the nifty thing about bolster pillows is that they are something that goes kind of with the mattress more than with the regular pillows, so to speak. It seems like they are typically stuffed with the same material as the main mattress for the bed, and what I can tell from the sort of manuscript images is that it's usually underneath the blankets and the sheets, so that it's really part of the mattress. It does kind of look like in the manuscripts as if a lot of the folks are kind of sitting up slightly in bed, but how much of that is artistic license or just because they are literally, it's a scene about them talking to someone while they're in bed? Not sure, but some kind of support is the goal here. Based on the written and visual evidence, it seems like there's typically a couple pillows per person, not including the bolster. And I noticed that a bunch of the manuscript images over and over and over showed this really neat pattern in kind of a couple different varieties, usually blue, but sometimes other colors. And I think it's fun. It's a neat little visual cue that they've added. So I got fabric that was as close as I could visually find when looking around for it at the store, and made up a couple of quick pillowcases. Now, I have a feeling that maybe it's related to ticking fabric. Modernly, we have a fabric called ticking fabric, and it's often white with blue stripes. Not typically this way, both ways, not plaid. I have a feeling there's some correlation there. If you know more, pop some links in the comments. Continuing on our bed making journey as we have so far, working from the ground up, next up is going to be the canopy. Now, I before was used to the like 4-poster version of a canopy where it's held up with these beams and you've got all the curtains around and it looks great. And there's some really lovely 16th century examples of that style, but whenever I found the 14th and 15th century versions, kind of late medieval, they're so cool. They're just like kind of magically floating in the air without the beams holding them up. Eventually, I was able to find some images that showed that the top was being held up with kind of cords that connected to the corners and then attached up to beams or to the ceiling. But it's neat. It has a magical feeling to it that I really dig. A typical setup might include several curtains around the edge of the bed, a tester, which is kind of like the ceiling of this setup, a valance, which covers up the top of the curtains where they connect to the rods themselves. You might have a headcloth near the front of the bed. A lot of these parts are very much choose your own adventure. The first thing that we worked on were the rods, which I'm pretty sure were usually metal. The inventories don't explicitly state metal rods, they just say rods. But looking at the manuscript images where they're visible, it seems like they're usually quite dark, black, and very, very thin, which I would have to imagine you'd want metal for it to be strong enough to hold stuff up. I think I saw maybe one wooden example, but I digress. We just decided to go for metal, and we spent a long time trying to figure out how we were going to construct the corners, and eventually settled on just peening them flat with lots of heat and hammering and heating and hammering, and then drilling a hole and then riveting those corners together. So that was definitely a 2-person job. It was really hard to hold onto the rod and hammer it and not have it accidentally kind of rotate and be weird. So having a second person to hold on to the back half of the rod while the front half person was able to do the actual hammering was very handy. We decided to make the rods just a smidge bigger than the outside perimeter of the total bed, so that way whenever the curtains hang from it, you won't have posts necessarily like poking out and creating a weird dent in the curtain. At least that's our thought. So we went ahead and put that all together. We didn't actually rivet all four corners though, our little insider kind of hack. We ended up using, I think, a bolt and nut to help keep one of the corners secured, but still be able to undo it in order to slide on rings if we needed to. I don't know that this riveting method is what they would have done in period. We don't have any extant rods to look at to know what they did. And the corners are always so hidden because of all the cloth and curtains and valances and stuff. So we made a guess and we will see how well it works out. We ended up using hooks to help secure the rod to the headboard area and made sure to thread a bunch of rings on before we did. And then for the footboard, that is secured and tied up to these posts, and hopefully that'll work pretty well. You can see a bunch more rings because we're gonna have to put curtains on next. Now, as for curtains, I could sew together my own curtains. That would be a very reasonable thing to do. However, we have this box of curtains that has been haunting us. It's a long story, but essentially we got them for free and kept meaning to put them up. I guess that they are going to become bed curtains instead. The one downside, can you tell me what color this is? That I don't want to limit myself to just shades of beige and tan. I can feel my past self just mercilessly teasing me about this. But you can't beat free. On the bright side though, at least once we have all these curtains up, it'll make a really, really nice contrast for the walls once they get painted. So I'm trying not to feel too bad about it. We could dye them, but I don't trust my ability to dye this in any way that resembles consistently. The valances I think are super cool. There's a bunch of extant ones that are super beautifully decorated, but I think I'm going to aim for the more manuscript looking style where it's typically a plain fabric with maybe a matching dangly trim fringe, maybe a contrasting one. I've chosen contrasting, although there's these really cool ones I've seen a few of where it's like several different colors for the trim. That is super neat, but we're gonna keep it relatively simple here and just go with one contrasting color. So I have finished sewing up the combination tester / valance. So let's hope that I measured everything correctly and that it looks good when I put it up. So the basic fit is pretty good, I think, but it needs a lot of tightening down, kind of like tightening up the ropes on the bed below. There's lots of areas here where I'm gonna need to really kind of secure it in place, and hopefully the tension will make it all hang a little bit more nicely. I am back and I've made myself a little kind of Viking-esque style chatelaine with some thread and a pair of little snippy snips so that now I can climb up and stitch each of these corners. Now on the manuscript ones, it looks like the valances are kind of continuous all the way around, but because I was using curtain fabric, I could only use lengths that the curtain itself came in. So there's no way I was gonna get a continuous look. I decided that it'd be better to just embrace the fact that the corners are gonna have seams. And so now I need to go ahead and go up and stitch the corners. This headboard cloth was kind of a last minute decision. I was noticing that some of the manuscript images had like an extra fancy sort of cloth there. Sometimes it's just the back, sometimes it's the back and the underside up here. I'm trying to keep this project fairly frugal, but I couldn't resist adding a fancy little headboard cloth, and I'm honestly really glad I did. I feel like I have a lot of very solid colors all around, so having something with a bit more of a pattern I think really draws the eye and makes the whole thing feel nicer, maybe? I don't know, I really, really dig it. And here we are. So part of what delights me to no end about doing things like this is that it gives me a chance to see why certain things were done because of the fact that I've physically done them. I was trying to figure out how it looked like the suspended iron bar or rods were the only thing kind of supporting everything, you know, along with the corners of them being supported by the ties, right? And I'm like, well, but wouldn't the fabric rub up against the curtains as they tried to close and open, and wouldn't that be weird? But because I just draped everything across and went, this isn't quite working, it wasn't until I really like with tension secured the ends of the top portion here to the ties. So they are floating just a little bit above the rods. The rods are still being held up by the ties, but the ties go through them, through the valance and tester here, and are tying up the rods. But I can now sit here and open and close the curtain to my heart's content, and it doesn't impede the movement at all. I'm sure someone looked at all of this and went, yes, of course, that's obvious. But I kept looking at it being like, that doesn't add up. So it's really, really neat to see how it works all put together like this. Have you guys noticed all of the, let's say, cocoon-shaped objects hanging from the corners of the beds throughout the pictures in this video? I noticed them and wondered how difficult it would be to put up a curtain like that, and it turns out not very difficult at all. I got it on my first try. You just twist it up all the way to the bottom, fold up the ends, and then tuck it up into the kind of top wherever you can, and it just stays. It is surprisingly quick and easy. It makes it so that you have a clear eyesight from the bed. It kind of makes it so that it's not as much visual weight in the room. It does look funny though. So in the end, that is one more project down for the cute little historical-ish cabin cottage situation, and so many more to go. I'm so glad that you guys joined me for a bit of fun and adventure and learning about something new. And yeah, I'm ready to take on the next thing. What about you?
Should give it some privacy.